52 BC, and the cold winds of central Gaul carry the scent of smoke, iron, and the desperate sweat of 80,000 defiant warriors. High upon the limestone plateau of Alesia, Vercingetorix, the charismatic chieftain who united the fractured tribes, looks down at the valley floor with grim satisfaction. He has chosen this ground perfectly. The hill is an island in a sea of rivers. Its slopes too steep for the heavy Roman infantry to climb. Below him, the most powerful man in Rome, Gaius Julius Caesar, stares upward at the fortress, realizing his lightning campaign has finally ground to a halt. Caesar knows that if he fails here, his political enemies in Rome will destroy him, but if he succeeds, he will become the master of the world. The Roman legions are exhausted from years of campaigning, yet they begin to unload their heavy packs, reaching for shovels and pickaxes instead of swords. Vercingetorix believes he has trapped Caesar in a stalemate, but he does not yet realize that the Roman soldier is, above all else, an industrial laborer. Caesar orders the unthinkable. He will not attack the walls of Alesia. He will build a new set of walls to choke the life out of it. The legionaries begin digging the circumvallation, an 11-mile ring of wood and earth that completely severs Alesia from the outside world and its food supplies. Thousands of trees are felled in the surrounding forests as Roman engineers calculate angles, depths, and logistics with the cold precision of a modern construction crew. But as the first mile of the wall rises, Gallic cavalrymen slip through the gaps at night, riding like shadows toward the distant corners of Gaul. Vercingetorix has sent a final, desperate plea to every tribe. If Alesia falls, Gaul dies. Assemble every man who can hold a spear and march on my position. Within days, Caesar's scouts return with terrifying news. A relief army of 250,000 Gauls is gathering like a storm on the horizon. Caesar is now the one in the trap, pinned between a starving fortress in front of him and a tidal wave of barbarians coming from behind. Any other general would have burned his camps and retreated, but Caesar decides to double down on his architectural madness and build a second wall. This second line, the contravallation, is 14 miles long, facing outward toward the forest to keep the massive relief army from breaking through his rear. The Romans are now living inside a fortress donut, a thin circular strip of land where they are both the hunters and the hunted. Between these two massive wooden rings, 50,000 Romans prepare to fight a war in two different directions at the exact same time. To survive, Caesar turns the ground itself into a landscape of mechanized death, designing defensive layers that would not be seen again until the World Wars. The first layer is a massive trench, 20 feet wide with vertical walls, designed to stop Gallic chariots and cavalry from ever reaching the main fortifications. Behind this trench, the Romans dig two more ditches, 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, diverted from the local rivers to create a stagnant, muddy moat of black water. Then come the Sippi, entire forests of sharpened branches, their bases buried deep in the earth and their points interlaced like the teeth of a beast. Behind the branches are the lilia, or lilies, thousands of pits hidden under thin brush, each containing a fire-hardened stake meant to impale a man's leg. And at the very front are the stimuli, iron hooks driven into the soil like prehistoric landmines, designed to tear the soles of Gallic feet to pieces. Finally, the main wall rises 12 feet high, topped with jagged battlements and massive wooden towers every 80 feet to provide elevated firing positions. Every soldier knows that if the Gauls breach either wall, there is no retreat. They are locked in a cage of their own making, fueled by iron. Inside Alesia, the sound of Roman hammers is replaced by the silence of starvation as the granaries empty and the horses are eaten one by one. Vercingetorix looks at the thousands of civilians, the elderly, the women, and the children, and realizes they are consuming the strength of his fighting men. In a moment of absolute horror, the gates of Alesia open and the non-combatants are pushed out into the no-man's land between the hill and the wall. Vercingetorix hopes Caesar will show mercy and let them pass. Caesar, knowing he cannot feed them or risk his lines, refuses to open the gates. For days, the Roman soldiers watch from their ramparts as thousands of innocent people slowly starve to death in the dirt, caught between two iron wills. The psychological toll on the Gallic warriors atop the hill is unbearable, as they watch their own families perish in the mud, unable to help. Suddenly, the silence is broken by the sound of 1,000 war horns. The relief army has finally arrived on the plains outside the outer wall. The horizon is a forest of spears and brightly colored banners as 250,000 Gauls prepare to crush the thin Roman line against the plateau. The Siege of Alesia has reached its breaking point. The donut is about to be squeezed from both sides in a symphony of fire and blood. The first assault begins at noon, with the relief army throwing themselves at the outer wall while Vercingetorix leads a desperate sally from the inner city. Gallic warriors use their shields to fill the Roman trenches with dirt, screaming their war cries as they navigate the fields of hidden spikes and hooks. Roman centurions stand shoulder to shoulder on the wooden walkways, raining down heavy pilum javelins that pierce through Gallic shields and pin them to their arms. The air is thick with the sound of catapults launching heavy stones and the rhythmic thud of battering rams hitting the Roman timber gates with bone-shaking force. For hours, the battle is a chaotic mess of iron and wood, with Caesar's men frantically running from the inner wall to the outer wall to plug gaps. The Gauls identify a weak point in the north where a steep hill prevented Caesar from completing a full, continuous line of fortifications. 60,000 elite Gallic warriors under the command of Vercingetorix launch a massive flanking maneuver toward this vulnerable northern gap in the Roman defenses. As the sun begins to set, the Roman lines at the northern camp begin to buckle under the sheer weight of the Gallic numbers and fury. Legionaries are being pulled from the walls and dragged into the trenches. The wooden towers are being set ablaze by Gallic torches and fire arrows. Caesar, watching from a high observation point, realizes his dream of empire is seconds away from collapsing into a pile of ash and Roman blood. He doesn't send a messenger. Instead, he dons his famous scarlet cloak, a brilliant, blood-red beacon that every soldier in the valley can recognize. The 9th and the 7th are failing, he shouts, and he personally leads his final reserve of 4,000 cavalrymen out from behind the walls. Caesar's red cloak flutters in the wind like a flame as he rides directly into the rear of the Gallic relief army, bypassing the trenches entirely. The sight of their commander fighting in the dirt, his red cloak stained with mud and blood, sends a jolt of lightning through the exhausted Roman ranks. The Roman cavalry slams into the Gallic flank like a hammer, their long swords carving through the unarmored backs of the startled barbarian warriors. The Gallic relief army, seeing the Roman demon himself leading the charge, panics and breaks, turning their backs to flee toward the safety of the woods. But there is no safety. The Roman cavalry hunts them down across the plains until the ground is literally carpeted with the bodies of the fallen. Vercingetorix, watching from the high walls of Alesia, sees his last hope of rescue dissolve into a disorganized rout in the twilight shadows. He realizes that Caesar has not just beaten his army. Caesar has beaten the very spirit of Gaul, turning their massive numbers into a liability. The next morning, a heavy silence falls over the valley, broken only by the cawing of crows circling over the thousands of unburied dead. The gates of Alesia creak open for the final time, and Vercingetorix emerges alone, riding his white warhorse through the fields of Roman traps. He rides up to Caesar's tribunal, where the Roman general sits surrounded by his battle-hardened officers and the blood-stained standards of the legions. In a final act of aristocratic defiance, the Gallic king dismounts, strips off his armor, and sits in silence at the feet of his conqueror. "I have fought for the freedom of my people," he might have whispered, but Caesar's eyes are as cold and calculating as the walls he built. Vercingetorix is taken in heavy chains to Rome, where he will spend 6 years in a dark dungeon before being strangled during Caesar's victory parade. The Siege of Alesia is over, and with it, the independent culture of the Celtic Gauls effectively ceases to exist for 1,000 years. This victory was not won by the sword alone, but by the shovel, the axe, and the terrifying logistics of the Roman military-industrial complex. Caesar had gambled 40,000 lives on a donut of wood and dirt, and he had won a prize greater than any gold. He had won history. The Gaul he conquered would become the heart of the Roman Empire, providing the men and resources that would sustain Rome for 5 centuries. Today, Archaeologists still find the rusted iron hooks and the lilies buried in the soil of the French countryside, perfectly preserved by time. These artifacts are a grim reminder that in ancient warfare, the man who could build the fastest was usually the man who would rule the longest. The strategy of the double wall at Alesia is still studied in military academies today as the ultimate example of the besieged becoming the besieger. It shows us that genius is often found in the most desperate of circumstances, where the only way out is to build a wall around the problem. Caesar's impossible wall was more than just a fortification. It was a psychological weapon that proved Rome could terraform the earth itself to achieve victory. As the smoke cleared from the plateau, Caesar sat in his tent and began writing his commentaries, ensuring his version of the story would live forever. He portrayed himself as the savior of Rome, but the mud and blood of Alesia told a much darker, more complex story of human ambition. The Gauls were a brave and noble people, but they were a collection of tribes fighting a man who commanded a machine. Alesia remains a haunting monument to the moment when the ancient, tribal world was crushed by the gears of the first modern empire. If you stand on that hilltop today, you can almost hear the rhythmic thud of Roman hammers and the ghost of a war horn in the wind. Julius Caesar didn't just win a battle at Alesia. He built a world, one sharpened stake and one bucket of dirt at a time.